Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our virtual webinar, Data and Dissent. This is an exciting event that we've been working on for some time at Free Press Action. My name is Nora Benavides. I will be moderating this tremendous discussion with luminaries in the field, from protest rights, press freedom experts, surveillance experts, journalists. It's really a tremendous set of people that we have here today. I want to set the stage very briefly and then introduce our panelists. The last several months have been incredibly challenging. We have seen across university campuses, students and others protesting and coming together in solidarity and action. Many of these are incredibly peaceful protest gatherings, and these activities have called for U.S. universities to divest from the U.S. government's support for Israel's attacks on Palestinians and Gaza. In the middle of these protests, we have witnessed escalating use of force by law enforcement, unprovoked arrests, the targeting of journalists covering these demonstrations, and a slew of downstream issues. There have been anti-free speech legislation and legislative proposals introduced in state capitals and in Congress. We have seen an expansion of federal government authority to spy on activists. It is a large set of sweeping threats to free expression and the ability for communities to come together. And we wanted to be able to bring experts into one virtual space to break down the state of protest rights today, the state of press freedom on university campuses, and frankly, what are the implications of a surveillance authority apparatus that chills people's interest or ability to express themselves when there are very little or no other avenues to do so. Today, we will be talking about the history of movement building in the United States, the kind of suppression that movements are often under, and the scrutiny by government. With us, we have Julie Mao of Just Futures Law, Tiffany Roberts of the Southern Center for Human Rights, our very own Jenna Ruddock of Free Press, and unfortunately, we have a little bit of a technical glitch that I'm hoping we will be able to fix. We have the illustrious Dell Cameron of Wired, who is only on audio right now. We may be able to get him on video, but his voice will be the voice of God, which is quite perfect for us. So with that, I didn't want to do longer introductions because these are some of the most amazing experts. And I see we have Dell, so there we go. Yay, Dell is here. What I'd love to do is turn it to each of you. And let's start with a really simple question. Introduce yourselves for the audience today and tell us, how are you coming to this work at this moment? What are the priorities you're thinking about? Let's start with Tiffany, and then we'll go through everyone. Thank you all so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Nora, thank you so much for having me. I'm the Public Policy Director at the Southern Center for Human Rights. We are a nonprofit law firm committed to decriminalizing race and poverty in the Deep South. We are located in Atlanta, Georgia, and we were founded because of human rights abuses of people who are facing the death penalty, and have expanded our work since that time. We'll be 50 years old in a couple of years. We've expanded our work to really address any issue in the criminal legal system which lands people who are marginalized in the crosshairs of that system. As it pertains to the rights of protesters or the right to dissent, we are coming at the work a couple of ways. One of the ways being formalizing our support systems or our support infrastructure for protesters who are prosecuted for First Amendment activity here in the state of Georgia. And another way is through traditional and grassroots policy advocacy, because the criminal legal system is always the net that catches people whom the government wants to ostracize when every other avenue fails. And what we are seeing is not only protests and First Amendment activity being attacked, but we're also seeing the state making it much more difficult for people to fight their cases outside of our jails. And so those are the primary ways that the policy unit at Southern Center is trying to be a good partner to folks on the ground in this moment.
Thank you, Tiffany. Julie, can we bring you in? I'd love for you to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Nora, and thanks so much for Free Press and hosting us. So my name is Julie Mao. I am a Deputy Director at Just Futures Law. I'm personally based out of DC, but we have staff across the country from California to places in the Southeast, like Georgia and North Carolina. And we are really a movement lawyering shop. My background is in civil rights litigation around labor exploitation, law enforcement abuse, and immigration. Previously, I lived in Louisiana, based out of Louisiana, working a lot on immigrant detention issues. And we basically do a mix of policy, litigation, and support of base building groups, grassroots groups who want to work at that intersection of organizing and also defending organizing, which unfortunately inevitably means, dealing with law enforcement, unfortunately increasingly vigilante surveillance and retaliation, and trying to limit the sort of forces of federal and police law enforcement and their powers around surveillance and criminalization.
Thank you, Julie. Jenna, can I bring you in?
Yeah, my name is Jenna Ruddock. I'm a policy counsel here with Free Press and Free Press Action. We are also based in DC, but have folks all over the place. I'm also a researcher and organizer kind of based in community in DC, where I organize also with the National Lawyers Guild of DC and Court Watch DC. And I'm currently a visiting fellow with the Critical Infrastructure Lab at the University of Amsterdam, where my research focuses on community resistance to technological infrastructures, right now, data centers in particular. So one thing that I'm really thinking about lately, both in the broader context of surveillance policy and also its intersection with First Amendment issues, both the right to protest and also press freedom issues, is just how we can better have conversations about surveillance that recognize it as never just being a passive phenomenon, like the sense that I often have, and I know folks have, that like the location data that's constantly being siphoned from our phones, or the fact that a lot of us can't leave the house without neighbors' Ring cameras or a CCTV camera recording that, doesn't necessarily impact our day-to-day lives, but instead understanding surveillance as an active measure of control, even when we're not feeling it or feeling aware of it, and how that can create a chilling effect that we might not be consciously aware of all the time, but that can really be brought to bear with force in moments like the one we're in now. I think surveillance is really baked into so many parts of our daily lives, not only state surveillance, but also for workers, surveillance by employers, for students, surveillance by schools at every level, for folks who are moving through the immigration system or the criminal legal system, not only surveillance by the agencies the government agencies they have to interact with, but also private contractors and intermediaries that those agencies use. And so all of these points of surveillance and control can be brought to bear, not just in the context of protests or reporters trying to exercise their rights, but also in a whole host of other ways. So thinking about our conversation today, that was one piece that I'm really sitting with, the fact that when we're talking about resisting surveillance and dealing with surveillance, there are steps that each of us can take to be more vigilant and secure, and we need to be having those conversations, but also really the fact that we're only as safe and secure as we are in community. And so this really has to be a collective conversation and a community level project.
Thank you, Jenna. And last but not least, Dell, I'd love to have you come in.
Thanks, Nora. My name's Dell Cameron. I'm a national security reporter at Wired Magazine. I've been a reporter for about 12 years and got started investigating the FBI's use of cyber informants sort of during the height of the anonymous movement, and later would focus on local law enforcement adoption of social media surveillance tools, predictive policing software, and just other tools that kind of blur the line between commercial and public security, like Ring doorbells. And I would say a lot of my focus today is really on sort of the evolution of national security and intelligence systems in the US in response to sort of rapid changes in technology and modes of communication. So most recently, for instance, since someone brought up data centers, I was reporting on the government's kind of work to open up US data centers to the same kinds of warrantless surveillance that have typically targeted US telecoms like Verizon and AT&T under foreign intelligence authorities.
Thank you so much, Dell. Well, it's wonderful to have all of you here. Again, for those that are just joining, this is our virtual webinar, Data and Dissent, Protest Rights and Press Freedom Under Surveillance, hosted by Free Press Action, with a tremendous set of speakers. I want to dive into some of the history of movement building here. And I think that's the right place to start. You know, there's so much here, but I look at what is happening across campuses in the United States, and frankly, the kinds of responses that we see from government. You know, both the use of force and arrest, as well as then other types of surveillance technologies. And I think this is really the place. I have been witness to Tiffany's work for almost a decade now, and I have the privilege of working with Jenna, of course. I'd love to hear from both of you. Tiffany, you have been, I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but one of just the most amazing leaders in the civil rights space here in Atlanta. We both live here. Watching your work has been such an honor and a privilege. And I think part of that is because we're not living in the 1940s, 50s, or 60s, and yet there are incredible hallmarks that are similar to those decades. And throughout our history here in the United States, we have seen student protests and protests more broadly, particularly those that try to espouse progressive values, be on the receiving end of various efforts to delegitimize them, to criminalize, to somehow cast these as violent. You know, whether it is the civil rights movement, whether it was responses to the Vietnam War, Occupy Wall Street, or even the most recent set of Black Lives Matter and protests that flowed from the murder of George Floyd. There is a very rich, powerful history of the use of protest where people are using their voices when they feel there are very little other avenues. And I'd love to hear first, Tiffany, from you about just how do you contextualize this moment in this broader history of movement building and the work of, frankly, just bringing people together?
Sure. I was, born in Atlanta, and I'm the daughter of an organizer here. When I look at where we are as a city, contextually, I'm both encouraged and deeply troubled. I'm encouraged because young people, students, and people who are experiencing the most harm continue to lead the way when it comes to pushing the city to move beyond this sort of cosplaying at progressive values. The Atlanta student movement is one of the most powerful hallmarks of what's possible when bureaucrats and others get out of the way of students. When the students in the Atlanta University Center decided to organize around segregation and other issues, and they went to the leadership at their colleges and told them what they wanted to do. The leadership first told them, well, publish your demands first. At least tell the city what you want. And if the city doesn't give you what you want, then we won't get in the way of broader activism. And they kept their word. So that's the encouraging part, is that these young people, we've seen the encampments. And one thing that's often lost, I think there was the New York Times published an article that said that students in the Atlanta University Center at Morehouse and Spelman were not organizing in this moment in the same way that students at Emory were. And what they're missing is that the students are organizing together across the city and are being strategic about how they message and where they sit. I'm discouraged because despite Atlanta's history, deep movement history, our governments, especially the city of Atlanta, and through partnering with the state government, right, so we have this consolidation of power by a so-called progressive city and a conservative state government, legislature, governor, and attorney general to engage in attacks on the right to dissent and the right to engage your government. They are working together to ensure that it is very difficult for anyone to organize without the threat of prosecution, without threats of being called a terrorist. And I have to say, I'm most disappointed by the ones of them who claim to hold the values that SNCC organizers held. We have seen an increasing use of state violence to address protests. Now, Nora, you and I have worked together when arranging mass defense for protesters in the city. And I would say from 2015 to present, every year, the level of force that law enforcement has used against protesters has increased. There is absolutely no reason that projectiles should be used on college campuses or anywhere really. But there is no outrage from this so-called progressive leadership. There is no outrage from the so-called progressive caucuses in the state legislature. And so I think that, the question for me as it pertains to Atlanta and other so-called progressive cities is not only where is your outrage, but where is your defense of these same people who you're going to come begging come election season? These are the same folks knocking doors. These are the same people that you try to leverage to phone bank for you, but they have absolutely no vocal and public support from you. Because like them, you're afraid of being called a terrorist, right? And so I believe that in many respects, our leadership has entirely lost its way and does little more than exploit Atlanta's history while really undermining the power of the people.
Thanks, Tiffany. I want to come back later in the discussion to some of what you've alluded to. You've sort of, lightly hinted at some of the larger forces in Atlanta and other cities that are abandoning community and some of the long-term history of working together. And I want to come back to that in a little bit. Jenna, to the extent you can, you're in a completely different city, a different environment, and layered on top of that, your ongoing work around anti-surveillance methods. How are you sort of coming to this moment, and how do you contextualize what's happening now as you're observing through the National Lawyers Guild and your work with Free Press in this moment?
I mean, I think it's interesting because I am in a completely different city, but just like Tiffany mentioned, students are doing in Atlanta. In DC, college students decided to get together and form a consortium. And while the student encampment was set up on GW's campus, which has gotten a lot of media coverage, what's gotten less coverage is that it's students from across the city who came together and decided how they were going to work and organize, and where they were going to kind of be in place given the geography of our city. And so it has been encouraging. It's always encouraging to see movements learn from prior movements, both in organizing context and also in terms of surveillance issues. I think kind of from a historical perspective, something I really try to hold on to is that there has not been a movement for justice in the history of this country that hasn't been surveilled and criminalized. And, you know, even just in terms of organizing around the civil rights movement, you know, leaders who are held up now as these examples of peaceful protest, like Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, were arrested dozens of times on charges that we see very frequently now, like disorderly conduct or trespass or resisting arrest or disturbing the peace. And so I think there's a lot of historical continuity in how protests have been and are continuing to be criminalized and surveilled. And at the same time, I do think we're in a unique moment, both in terms of the surveillance technologies that are now available to increasingly militarized police forces, and then also due to what's been alluded to in terms of the waves of anti-protest laws we've seen in the wake of major protest movements in just the last decade. So in Ferguson, or since Ferguson, there have been at least 154 anti-protest laws or executive orders that have been introduced across the country, according to the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law. And I know Nora can also speak to this because she's done her own research tracking and tallying this as well. And that's how we first crossed paths. But these laws specifically target types of protests and protest strategies that have been embraced by different movements. So like after Ferguson, we saw a lot of proposals to heighten the penalties for blocking roadways. After the protest at Standing Rock, we saw a dramatic increase in proposals to increase the penalties for blocking pipeline constructions. And as Tiffany also alluded to, I think these draconian penalties that we're seeing in these anti-protest proposals also serve a narrative role. So, for example, accusations of terrorism have increasingly been raised before this moment against environmental justice activists, racial justice activists, like folks who are resisting the construction of Cop City in Atlanta, and then now similar patterns with student activists. And so I think that kind of historical framework is really important to me, and kind of the broader theme that we see there too, in terms of how protests are portrayed and described and how that is used to justify increased surveillance and criminalization, including kind of dichotomies around lawful versus unlawful and peaceful versus violent, something that doesn't really grapple with both kind of in the moment, how we see authorities actively redefining what is lawful, how we see legislators passing anti-protest laws, but also kind of on the ground, how police can issue a dispersal order and all of a sudden it's no longer lawful to be in a place that it was perfectly lawful to be in just a moment before. And so kind of keeping that complexity around how critical civil disobedience has been to our moments throughout history, and how kind of the nature of that civil disobedience has been used to then justify greater surveillance and greater repression is something that I've been kind of really digging into now as well.
Thank you so much, Jenna. I want to remind people that we have our Q&A function, and I see that the Q&A is starting to populate with questions. As they come to you, please enter them. We will reserve a few minutes at the end for Q&A, and I'll try to get to as much as possible. You know, this was an interesting segue, Jenna, not one that I was anticipating, and I will not go rogue on all of you, but you know, it makes me think a little bit about the way that protest and movements are portrayed. And of course, implicates the presence of and the necessity of journalistic coverage. Throughout recent demonstrations over the last decade, we've seen ongoing efforts to minimize journalistic and media presence. You know, during the George Floyd protest, which until recently, I think we could say was the largest, longest, and most sustained movement we've ever seen around the world, with the largest number of protests and demonstrations. And there were hundreds of attacks on journalists and those who were trying to film or otherwise just document what was going on across cities around the world. much of the desire to document, I think, arose out of the need to correct what the narrative was and recast what was trying to be framed as somehow criminal or violent. And to your point, Jenna, that effort, that sort of narrative has taken hold and perpetuates and legitimizes crackdowns on free speech. And it makes me worried about the state of press freedom, because it's sort of, I feel like journalists are often like lawyers, you don't like them until you need them, and then you love them and you need them. And I want to bring Dell in because there's a really surreal dynamic here that, on the one hand, there is an overarching narrative that is being cast about movements generally, that these are somehow, one, impenetrable. They are likely leaning towards violence, and yet efforts to understand how government is surveying communities remains incredibly difficult to ascertain. In fact, some of the long undetected surveillance practices that we now know about from the George Floyd protests, for example, have taken years to come to the surface. Just as one example, the Brennan Center just published a piece about the Washington, D.C. Police Department's surveillance of peaceful and First Amendment protected activities during the summer of 2020, following George Floyd's murder. They learned that the DC police circulated unverified information like demonstration flyers and screenshots of posts by protesters on mass email threads with private entities, local, state, and federal agencies. Their monitoring was incredibly biased, speculating about social media posters' affiliation with Antifa, tracking organizers and phrases related to Black Lives Matter with no evidence of risk to public safety. But it has now taken 4 years for this to come to light after protracted FOIA efforts and litigation. And so there's this weird disconnect. And Dell, I want to bring you in here. What are some of the implications? You've been studying and covering the large federal government surveillance apparatus. What are you thinking about in the middle of all of this?
I appreciate that you started with the historical perspective on it, because I think there's a big chasm of information about the origins of domestic political surveillance, that knowledge that kind of dissipates generation to generation, to the point that people kind of view authoritarian tactics that they're witnessing as somehow like a new phenomenon or a post 9/11 phenomenon, or that there was this long break following the anti-war protests of the 1970s, and then there was this giant, boost of surveillance and anti-war activities after 9/11. But that's ahistoric, and I think, really it's the concept that police agencies in the United States serve primarily or just strictly a law enforcement function, I think, is the flawed information that people are carrying around, that intelligence gathering and surveillance is something that the federal government, the military, and its 20 spy agencies are primarily involved in. I don't want to go too far back into history or linger there for too long, but it was really the intelligence lessons that we learned in World War II, primarily from the British, that kind of came back to bear on American society, at first at the federal level, coinciding with the war, targeting communists in the United States, and then organized crime. And I think that this is important now, because organized crime was really the impetus for the formation of police intelligence units in the United States. There was a major schism between the FBI and police departments in the 50s and early 60s, to the point where, based around sort of the argument that the feds were coming in and soaking up all the work product of these local police departments. And so they began to form their own intelligence organizations in the US, intelligence agencies, you could even say, in the US, because their primary purpose was to gather intelligence and share it among themselves. There was one organization that was founded in the late 50s that registered as a charity in California, and it still exists. And I know that at least in the 70s, it had like 230 police departments, and federal agents were forbidden from joining this organization. They didn't want the feds involved. And this is, cross-state intelligence gathering and sharing, including these vast databases of dossiers on Americans. And coming back to organized crime, it was sort of a slippery slope or mission creep concept where, eventually someone said something like, these subversive elements in society, which were mostly students, but Black liberation, women's liberation, really anyone plotting to engage in labor activities, anti-militarization, the peace movement as a whole, or as the police would call them, sympathizers. These people were, there was an argument that, what is organized crime, sort of, if not these groups of subversives who are here to reject and undermine the American system of government. So there was sort of a mission creep where eventually we had the formation of red squads in the United States, police everywhere gathering and spying on people. And that did not stop in the 70s or even the 80s. And we see, for instance, like the Denver spy files, we had, a police department in Denver that was collecting information on thousands of people who were just involved in regular sort of protests and peaceful anti-war demonstrations and things like that. So there's been a real, I think, slippery slope effect of domestic police intelligence activity in the distant past, and these strong parallels that we're seeing now. Look at the actions in the words of the NYPD. Those are very reminiscent of the types of public relations comments that you would see in the 1970s from police departments as they raided students on campuses. And to the point you were making about like the Antifa kind of stuff, we know that during 2020, we had the Department of Homeland Security doing this exact same thing, trying to establish that protesters in Portland specifically were part of a criminal organization and maybe even a terrorist organization by surveilling them, coming up with creating these dossiers on them, doing social mapping, and trying really hard, and I think this is really important for this moment, is to establish that they had some sort of foreign backer or there was a foreign element to them. And I think that that's key for messaging for the FBI and for the intelligence community, but I think it also likely lowers evidentiary thresholds and allows the government to engage in more invasive forms of surveillance when it has that foreign element to it.
Well, it's really heavy. Dell, you can't go too far into history for me, and I doubt for this audience. I tried really hard to not talk about 1400s in Britain and the ties to the Fourth Amendment. So, and I see Julie laughing here. So, it's a fascinating discussion. I see more people are joining. Thank you all so much for coming. We have questions in the Q&A that are coming in, and I will get to those in the final 10 minutes. But I want to bring Julie in here. Julie, you've been so elegant in sort of waiting to come in. And I guess it relates to some of what Dell has talked about, because there is a very real effort to delegitimize certain speech. And I believe some of that, I want you to talk a little bit about who is particularly singled out, what types of community groups and individuals or swaths of people are seen as somehow necessarily delegitimized. And given your work, I think you have a lot of interesting and unique views. So I'm eager to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I think that for us, we really see sort of the most targeted and vulnerable communities as sort of being intersectional. Right? Kind of like folks were talking about, like the students aren't coming from one university. It's a sort of constellation of many universities. I think the folks who are the most vulnerable have so many intersectional identities. And for us, the ones that we see the most needing sort of structural and individual support are really folks who are Black and Brown protesters, who also have immigration status issues. And I think the thing to understand is that, when it comes to the First Amendment, yes, there is this protection that we assert, that we defend, that you have a First Amendment right to protest, to engage in speech, right? But for example, folks who are Black and brown, the level of police harassment, as Tiffany was saying, around like the retaliation on the criminalization side, is so intense. And then you add on sort of the issues of migration status, where, for example, in DC, we have a mixed federal and local criminal justice system where federal police actually are manning our jails and manning our courts, right? That adds such another layer of sort of risk where you can engage in speech. But what if you are wrongfully arrested at a protest? What if you are brought to the courthouse and then transferred to ICE and are therefore in deportation proceedings? Are folks' rights actually, able to be exercised when the consequences of exercising your constitutional rights are so drastic? We're talking incarceration, a very aggressive criminal proceeding followed by potential detention and deportation. And so kind of to bring this home a little bit, I really appreciated, Nora, you talking about sort of like, oftentimes the surveillance happens for a very long time, and then either we never hear about what happens, or we're made to feel paranoid about whether or not it is happening. And then some sort of action happens. And I think, Jenna, you would also kind of alluded to this, as like surveillance harm isn't just like the actual surveillance itself. It's far more than that, right? It isn't invisible. It's actually these types of physical harms. And so, if you will indulge me, I thought it might be helpful to kind of share what the immigrant rights movement has to deal with at certain times. Let's see if I can get this to be shared. Are folks able to see that?
Yes, we see that you started sharing your screen. We haven't seen any actual images.
Yeah, I think that maybe there's something wrong with this. So let me see if I can correct that. But basically, what we kind of think about is that surveillance is sort of like an iceberg. The bottom of the iceberg is really all the surveillance that is happening. And then the tip of the iceberg that people actually see is the retaliation that happens. And so, unfortunately, the way that individuals come to us for sort of legal support is the actual retaliation that's happening. And so when we, have people come to us, they're either charged with something, they're dealing with some sort of immigration or deportation case, and it really takes litigation, public records requests, many of the things that I think journalists also do the labor on, to really get to actually understanding what actually happened, what led to their, this sort of level of retaliation, in order to actually uncover what type of surveillance is happening. And I think that that's been sort of a huge issue for us and a huge challenge to dealing with the surveillance itself, is that oftentimes it can only surface when there's some sort of retaliatory action around that. And I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Julie. And maybe you'll be able to get your technology working. Technology fails us, which we know. And as this panel knows, and this audience knows very well. Well, I have so many more questions. I want to sort of narrow down just to one and then open it up to the audience. I want to talk a little bit about broader and escalating threats to individuals here in the United States. And particularly, Jenna already hinted a little bit at this. Some of it is around anti-protest sentiment and legislation. I think there are other issues that we're thinking about. Tiffany, given your work in Atlanta, there are troubling and already ongoing efforts to delegitimize the Stop Cop City movement. And Dell, given your research and writing, there is a current expansion and bolstered authority for our federal government to surveil communities. I want to give just a couple of facts here. In the last several months, we have seen 28 state proposals that, to Jenna's point, would criminalize the types of activities that students and others on university campuses are participating in. And there have been almost a dozen federal pieces of legislation introduced similarly to target financial aid for university and student protesters, to limit the use of masks, that people would be able to actually be anonymous during protests. One bill would force individuals who are convicted of certain protest-related crimes to be sent to Gaza for experience there. There is a large and, I think, long tail to what we're now seeing, where various sectors are taking actions that are happening on university campuses and being inspired in some way to leverage that moment. I also think that these are the types of moments that then ultimately help legitimize ongoing surveillance of communities in months and years to come. It's an election year. These are issues that might, frankly, get forgotten from a surveillance perspective. People will be worried about arrests, and then once protests and demonstration, go down, we move on. And that's a very human reaction. It's like we can only live in that type of crisis concern in waves. And so I'm thinking for all of you, in my final question, what do you think about in this moment as you look ahead? The broader escalating threats and the implications for your work, whether it's with immigrant communities, the larger apparatus of surveillance technologies. How are you now thinking about the next 3-5 years and what this might mean as we're seeing what's playing out now? And anyone can jump in here.
Over the next 3 to 5 years, I have no reason, I don't think any of us have any reason to believe that the erosion of our civil liberties will not escalate, or at least that the state won't attempt to ensure their escalation. The surveillance piece really cannot be overstated. Atlanta is the most surveilled city in the nation. And our local government continues to put forth proposals that would heighten surveillance, and have been pretty transparent about that surveillance being targeted in some of Atlanta's poorest and Blackest zip codes. An example of that is there is an effort that the Atlanta Community Press Collective unearthed that would create a relationship between our cameras that are on the streets and monitoring wristbands that people who are on pretrial release wear, so that the government could track people using their wristbands and then locate them on our city's cameras. And these wristbands would have audio and visual recording capabilities or monitoring capabilities. There doesn't seem to be enough outrage about this even being proposed. And there is no reason for us to believe that there is any sense of what a stopping point could be on even something as problematic as people who are presumed innocent being released on bail, being required to be monitored with wristbands, and potentially being followed by cameras every hour of the day, which of course would heighten the chances or increase the chances that their bonds could be revoked, for example. That reality, when coupled with the fact that more and more people, due to Georgia's approach to public safety, are going to be on pretrial release because it's becoming easier and easier for people to be arrested. A law was just passed, Senate Bill 63, which adds 30 more charges to bail required offenses in Georgia. And 2 of those are criminal trespass and unlawful assembly. these are obviously intended to target civic engagement, First Amendment activity, especially as we move closer to an election, right? And so if it is effective in part in places like Georgia because of complicity between the complicity of progressives, then it can be successful anywhere. And there is no reason for the government to backtrack if there is not organized pushback from people on the ground, and they consistently complicate the ability of people on the ground to organize. So I don't mean to give a bleak outlook, but I do think that it is absolutely essential. I see some of the questions in the chat that people who are concerned about these issues are vocal, even when you believe that these are insignificant policy shifts, because when in aggregate, so when we have them all together, they actually have pretty catastrophic consequences that are not only going to implicate organizers, but as we talk about jail conditions, prison conditions, we have record deaths in our jail in Atlanta. All of these things will suffer collateral consequences of this authoritarian shift, or I don't know if it's a shift, but escalating authoritarianism in the country. And so there are organizations everywhere working on every issue that we're talking about today, and they need more support from people who can't so easily be painted as outlier radicals, even though I do believe that the people who make the real changes are the folks who are most feared.
I mean, I think just quickly hopping from what Tiffany was saying, I think so much of the solution to pushing back on these, sort of horrible and horrifying attacks on freedom of speech and protesters is more protesters, right? Is more organizing. And that's, I think, what folks were kind of talking about this sort of circular problem that we are having, where the surveillance and then the subsequent retaliation is really to chill and clamp down on the organizing. And then the organizing is really necessary to push back and stop the retaliation and the surveillance. And so in that context, I want to recognize for the folks on the call, the individuals who are out there, who are doing the press work, who are doing the protesting, just how much the stakes are for people in this moment, and maybe perhaps how much worse it could get at certain times. So in the immigrant rights movement, we kind of talk about like, we're targeted, but we're not silenced, because they do win, right? Like the police, the vigilantes, the federal agencies like DHS, they win when we are silenced and we don't speak for ourselves and speak from our own experience. So I do want to recognize one of the immigrant organizers that we've represented in the past, who has been supporting hunger strikers in some of the detention centers in the Northwest, who was put into proceedings because of her activism, is here with us today, Maru Mora Villalpando. And it really requires us, I think, to work in collaboration, at least at Just Futures, with lawyers, with journalists, with folks on the ground to really push back around these issues.
Thank you, Julie. Dell, I see you've unmuted. Come on in.
Yeah, just, someone said something earlier that I thought was really important about sort of the chilling effect, consequence of surveillance. And I think it's important to recognize that that's not a byproduct in every circumstance. It's just very traditionally a tactic that's been used in the US to sow paranoia in people. And that, I think that's the quote from the commission to investigate the FBI, the group that broke into an FBI office in the early 70s and helped reveal the existence of the COINTELPRO program, found documents, and the FBI was talking about the need to sow paranoia among groups I think the actual quote was to convince them that there was an agent hiding behind every mailbox. Those documents pointed to a lot of really insidious behavior by the Bureau, trying to convince leaders of anti-war movements that their wives were cheating on them. They revealed that the FBI had broken into journalists' houses and were infiltrating groups using a network of informants that would be recycled across the U.S. Once they'd been caught, they would ship them somewhere else so that they could begin their process of infiltrating other groups. And I've made the comparison before, and I don't know how far-fetched it is, but between the use of informants then and today, the fact that, well, for one, that the FBI and police agencies have really little need to keep files on people anymore. If the FBI wants to compile a file on someone, it can draw that information from hundreds of disparate databases, commercial and public. So there's no real need for them to maintain these tall file cabinets like the kind that was stolen during that break-in. In a way, we have this ecosystem of data brokers that are serving almost the same function as informants on campuses. Then we have companies that are tracking, people's location 24/7. And as much as they claim that information is anonymized, it is absolutely proven that you can de-anonymize that information. In fact, the purpose of that commercial information, which the government argues that it can buy regardless of the Carpenter decision, that decision did not apply to national security. That was something that the Supreme Court noted, that it didn't apply to national security cases, but the government is taking that as sort of permission to go ahead and compile as much location data on people as it can. And that is serving the same function as having this network of informants across the United States. So I think, anyway, to come back to the paranoia thing, I think that we're seeing the consequences of that already. I mean, people are, just as they were in the past, are afraid to have conversations in public. I guess, on the question of what I'm looking at over the next couple of years, I've been focused pretty heavily over the last year on the 702 program, which was abused repeatedly by the FBI to target Black Lives Matter protesters. They used it against January 6th defendants. They've used it against political donors. And I was really surprised by the amounts. I don't know, I guess it sounds naive, but just the amount of lying that went on during that debate in Congress. I published a story last week and had someone at the FBI get extremely angry with me that I had phrased our headline around the use of warrantless wiretaps. They don't like that term. They prefer the narrative that this is a program that is the motivation for which is to target foreigners, and they don't really like to talk about the end result of that intelligence process or how that information is used after it's collected. So I would be looking probably at how that program is used. It will take a very long time to understand how it's being used right now in this moment while there are these protests going on. But we reported a couple of months ago that there were conversations, briefings with intelligence community members and congressional members on the intelligence committees, which, I don't know, work pretty closely in tandem these days. The joke, that I hear most often on the Hill is that is about intelligence oversight, and that being used as a pun most of the time. So anyway, they collect hundreds of millions of messages each year, phone calls, and that stuff is available to be accessed without a warrant. And we don't know to what degree they're looking at student protesters now and saying, well, you know, someone in this group is having conversations with a Palestinian organization overseas. The uncle of, you know, one of the organizers of that group is related to someone who is a member of Hamas. And does that give the US government the right to start listening to the phone calls and reading through the emails of protesters on US college campuses? We don't know the answer to that question. I think, you know, the issue with that is that we would be, you know, very unlikely to ever get that answer because that program does not require individualized warrants. The, you know, secret court that oversees it doesn't hear, you know, individual cases. So that's something I'm pretty concerned about. I'm also pretty concerned about Donald Trump getting reelected and using the Department of Homeland Security in the same way he was using it before. Because I had mentioned earlier about them creating these dossiers, which they call baseball cards, which I always thought was funny, on Americans, and using social mapping and all this technology to try just desperately to connect them to some organization overseas so they could definitively say that this organization exists called Antifa, and that they could then, you know, unleash the federal government's full, you know, surveillance capabilities on that group. But I think that one of the primary reasons they wanted to do that to begin with was to help validate the claims of the president, which were political and were meant to, you know, serve as part of his reelection campaign, that there was a, you know, this insidious enemy within our midst argument, which is really handy for rendering illegitimate one's status as an American. And you can see a lot of that going on right now with lawmakers and some media figures calling to deport people involved for participating in protests, which is essentially a call to revoke their citizenship. So one of the things that I'm focused on is sort of the concept of foreignness and how it is the preferred boogeyman of repressive regimes. And we were talking about old quotes. I don't like to throw founding father quotes around too much, but it was James Madison famously, it was said that the loss of liberty at home paraphrasing here, is charged to provisions against danger from abroad, real and imagined. And what he meant by that is that of all the powers entrusted to the federal government, foreign affairs is the most easily abused because Americans are mostly unfamiliar with it, and information can be easily withheld from them or deployed strategically to sway public opinion. And he said that we're also more under the influence of prejudices when it comes to this particular use of power as opposed to other governmental affairs.
Dell, there's a lot there. And now we are a minute over. I wanted to be able to ask a couple more follow-up questions. Unfortunately, we wanted to keep this at a tight 2 p.m. close. So here's what we'll do. We've gotten a number of excellent questions. I've tried to, where possible and where we did touch on them, I acknowledged it. Thank you all so much for coming. Here's what will happen next. Everyone who registered will get a link to the recording. If you missed part of this, you will receive a link and you can rewatch whatever you missed. If you had a question and we were not able to answer it, if you want to sign up for our mailing list, we will be sending some follow-up materials. This seems to be a topic that people have tremendous interest in. And the fervor and the attendance here shows us that we clearly need to be doing more of this. I want to thank our partners here, Dell Cameron, Julie Mao, Tiffany Roberts, and our very own Jenna Ruddock. Thank you to all of your organizations and news outlets for the work that you are doing. Thank you to everyone who attended, and to our back-end support from the Free Press team and Free Press Action team. Thank you all so much. As we move forward, let's move forward in the spirit of solidarity and togetherness. That is essential in what we do. We will be planning more, so stay tuned. Thanks so much.